Hello and welcome back to the Stevenson Weekender sailboat build. In this video we're going to get the seats for the cockpit built. I'm starting out here getting the stringers for the bottom of the front panel for the seats laid out. They're cut to length and then spaced away from the center line on each side according to the measurements in the plans. Since the bottom is already fiberglassed and painted, I decided to avoid screws through the hole into these stringers, and I'll count on the epoxy to hold them down. The bottom hole does have a slight concavity to it, so I used that ratchet pole to brace against the ceiling and push the center of the stringers down into the epoxy. Short stringers were attached aft and forward, and then I'm ready to create a template for the seat fronts. For the template, I'm using some short strips of scrap wood and a hot glue gun. Those straight up and down vertical pieces match the measurements in the plans, but everything else is fit custom to the lazarette front and the cabin bulkhead there. This horizontal piece is then glued flush with the top of those vertical pieces so that the height of the front panel will match the plans. And then I fill in the spaces with the short pieces. In order to work around my hold downs there, I used a stir stick and marked its position. And then I was able to remove the template and then glue that stir stick in place according to the marks I'd made. I got the template laid out on some 1/4 inch plywood. I'll get the shape marked out, and then the plans call for a rectangular hatch to be cut in before the panel is installed. Now I'll use that first panel to mark out for the opposite side, and then I'll get it cut out as well. Now that the epoxy has cured, I'll remove that ratchet pole and we'll get these front panels glued in place. I decided to try to use this pneumatic stapler to attach this to the stringers just to save time. It did save time, but it did tend to chip out some of the fibers of the plywood towards those thin edges. So now I'll work on the pattern for the seat partition. I'll do that in the same way with the thin pieces of scrap wood and the hot glue gun. I'll get these pieces cut out of the 1/4 inch plywood as well. I'm going to need an angled stringer to attach the top of the seat to this front seat panel in the partition. So I'm using that angle finder to get the correct angle to cut this stringer. Here I'm gluing some stringers to the partitions to get ready to put them in the boat. To make things easier, I only attach stringers to the bottom and inboard side of this partition. Since there won't be any screws through the side hole into the stringer of this partition along the outboard edge, I wanted to wait and glue that in after the partition was in place and these other stringers with their epoxy had cured. That may not have made a lot of sense, but as you'll see here, when I put the partition in, there's a small gap there along the side panel. I'll get the partition attached to the front panel there into the bottom hole, and then I'll let the epoxy cure and then come back later and get that outboard and top stringer attached to the partition so that everything will be flush and snug against the panels in all areas of contact. Okay, so now it's the next day and I'm going to get those other stringers glued in place. Now that the seat partition was in, I could use that to mark the height where the stringer needs to be that the outboard part of the seat top will rest on. I came up with this idea of using a shadow that I could cast across the front of the seat panel and then line the shadow up with the mark I just made along the outboard side panel there. I can then use a pencil to make marks all along the shadow line. These marks should represent where the stringers need to sit in order to hold the top seat panel. So now I'll get those stringers glued to the side panel along those marks. Because I'm not putting any screws through the side panel, I had to get creative with bracing to hold that stringer in place while the epoxy cured. So here's a shot of everything braced up, waiting for the epoxy to cure. for all the stringers. But that worked pretty well, and the next day I was able to come and remove all that mess and get ready to make the pattern for the seat tops. I'm again using the hot glue gun and small pieces of scrap wood to make the pattern. The plans say that you can use either 1/4 inch plywood or 3/8 inch plywood for these seat tops. And since I had some 3/8 inch plywood left over from the top deck cutout, I chose to use that as I figure the seat tops will get stepped on a lot getting in and out of the boat. As you can see, the saw is angled a little bit. I tried to match the angle of each cut to the panel that it was going to mate up against. Now I'm going to lay out and get the stringer attached that the seat back will sit against. There's a fairly significant curve to the stringer, so my technique was to put in a screw and then force the stringer along the line I'd drawn, and then put in the next screw and work my way down the bend until I had the whole thing done. Then I took it all apart again and applied epoxy and screwed it back down. After the epoxy had hardened, I trimmed off the ends of those stringers where they had run long. So while I still had access to the internal compartments there, I decided to put a coat of unthickened epoxy on everything just to seal it and somewhat waterproof it. I'll have to decide later if I want to come back and put any paint on these areas, but if I decide to do that, I'll have to reach in through the openings, which will be harder to do, so I'll have to see what I'm feeling when we get to that point. I also coated what will be the underside of the seats to provide a little bit of a moisture barrier. But now that I have everything sealed, I'll come back with some thickened epoxy and get the seats put in place. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to round over the edges of the seat with a round over bit and a router. So here I'm filling in the screw holes so that the bearing on the router bit won't drop into them. For the seat backs, I decided to deviate from the plans just a little. The plans call for having a straighter seat back that dives in under the forward portion of the upward deck. There is more of a curved surface. I decided I wanted to try to make it a little fancier and fit the seat back to that curve using some curve cuts that you'll see me do here in a few seconds. It was more work, but I think in the end it turned out well and will look better overall when I get to the finished product at the end. So because there's so much more curve to this pattern, I decided to make it out of cardboard instead of the sticks and hot glue that I was using before. I made the pattern for the starboard side first and then used that pattern as a rough guide to make the port side pattern. I left the top edge to run wild, and I'll trim that off after I get the actual piece of paneling put in place so that the top edge will be exactly flush with the top deck. So these seat backs get cut out of 1/4 inch plywood, and I'll use my patterns there to mark them out and then get them cut. So here I'm making a pattern of the curve there at the front of the cockpit where it meets the cabin bulkhead. I'm going to cut that shape out and then use that to hold my board in place as I do a little bit of steam bending. First I'll mark out for my curve cuts. I did try to bend this plywood since it's fairly thin without doing any curve cuts, and it did not work. It split. So this worked fairly well. I just have my depth of cut there on my saw set to leave about 1 millimeter of material behind. And here I have 2 wet pieces of rag that I'm going to sandwich the board between and use that hot iron that I left on for about a minute. And then I'll use that pattern I'd made to hold the shape of the board in place while it cools down. This is the stringer for the top of the seat back that you'll see there. I put those curve cuts in it as well to help it make the bend. Like I've done with other curved stringers, I first get it dry fitted in place with all the clamps and then make my pilot holes for the screws that will hold the stringer in place along with the epoxy. Both for looks and for comfort, I wanted to round over the edge of the seat, but because the seat front and the seat top there are not at a 90 degree, I had to create that little wedge shaped filler piece to put on the bottom of my router in order to get a nice smooth round over. The router wouldn't reach all the way to the edges, so I had to do that by hand. Now I'll finish up with getting the seat backs put in place. I started by getting the front curve there snugged up as best I could and then worked my way backwards. Now that it's dry fit in place, I'll come back with this flush trim oscillating saw and trim the top edge of that back panel piece flush with the top deck. So I'll repeat the procedure for the port side. My plan is to apply a generous fillet on all those inside corners, and then I'll fill in the kerf cuts with epoxy as well and get that sanded fair. So I'm not going to epoxy the seat backs in place just yet. I'm going to need access to the side hole behind them in order to put the rub rails on. So I'm going to leave these in place for now just with screws. So now the cockpit seats are almost finished, and I'm glad they turned out as good as they did. I especially enjoyed this part of the build. Next time we're going to start working on the rub rails out of mahogany, and may have some time to start working on the cabin. As always, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And I hope you'll join me next time as we continue building the Stevenson Weekender sailboat.